Hello and welcome to another episode of Smart Freight Conversations, where we share interesting and important information and updates about freight decarbonization and the drive towards a zero emissions logistics industry. My name is Andy Golding. I'm the head of Academy here at Smart Freight Center, or SFC, as you'll hear us call it, and I'm your host for today. Today is part 3 of a 3-part series exploring climate logistics and going beyond decarbonization to look at the broader role of logistics in the climate crisis. As we have had for parts 1 and 2 of this series, I'm joined again today by none other than Professor Alan McKinnon. As I hope you know by now from listening to episodes 1 and 2 of this series, Alan is a rock star in the logistics space. I'm just going to call it like that. Alan is globally recognized as an authority on logistics, on transport decarbonization. He is a professor at the Kühne Logistics University. He has advised organizations like the OECD and the World Economic Forum. And there are very few voices as influential and I would argue as impactful as Alan's in the push for the decarbonization of global logistics. In part 1 of the series, we looked at climate logistics and the numerous roles that logistics plays in the climate crisis. In part 2, we zoned in on the 5 decarbonization levers. And in this third and final episode, we're looking to go beyond mitigation and towards resilience and adaptation. Alan, third time, here we are. Great to have you back.
Yes, I think the previous 2 discussions went very well, so I'm looking forward to this one, and particularly as you've characterized me as a rock star, a rather elderly rock star as it happens, but I'll do my best to live up to that expectation.
I have full confidence in you, Alan. Full confidence. Diving right in, you've written a lot, but you've written about the relationship between logistics decarbonization and resilience. How do the two interact?
Okay, so to provide some background on that, the paper that I wrote was for the International Transport Forum. It was part of the OECD Strategic Infrastructure Program for Asia. And what they asked me to do was to look at the interconnections between freight decarbonisation and freight transport resilience. To do that, what I did was I looked at attributes of decarbonisation on the one hand and attributes of resilience on the other. So in the case of decarbonisation, I used the 5-lever framework, which we've discussed in previous podcasts. So that is freight transport demand, modal split, asset utilization, energy efficiency, and carbon intensity. So those were my 5 attributes for decarbonisation. And on the resilience side, I looked at 6 things. So one is sourcing of materials. Second was intermodality. Third was redundancy, the amount of redundancy there is in the freight transport systems and supply chains. The fourth was scheduling. To what extent were the deliveries made on a just-in-time basis, for example? The fifth was what I call diversity. And I defined that as the options for rerouting freight or switching suppliers or changing energy sources, for example. And then the sixth attribute was visibility. In other words, relating to the nature and speed of communication about disruptions within a freight transport system. And what I then did was I looked at the interconnections between these attributes. So there were 30 possible interconnections, but some of them are not very relevant. So I focused in on 12 of the interrelationships. And the good news is that of the 12, I reckon that 8 of them, 2/3 of them, were synergistic. In other words, the things you would do to cut carbon would also help to improve resilience. But it was not a complete alignment between decarbonisation and resilience. There are 2 other relationships which were conflicting, and then 2 others which I described as being hybrid, because they could either be mutually reinforcing or conflicting depending on local circumstances as well. But the good news was that there's a lot of commonality here, it seems to me, between efforts to decarbonise freight transport and also to improve its resilience.
So you say that there were 12 that had this, there were 30, but you focused on 12
Yep,
and 8 that were synergistic.
correct.
Can you maybe say more about the ones that were synergistic? Because I think that I know, at least for me, when we talk about logistics decarbonization and resilience at the same time, it feels like they need to work together because
Mhm.
we're decarbonizing logistics for the resilience of the planet and the resilience of life as we know it. So, if we're talking about the synergistic aspects,
Mhm.
what
Well,
are they?
okay, so there are some obvious ones. The link between modal shift on the one hand and intermodality on the other, for as the resilience variable. Because if you disperse your freight across more freight transport modes, if you're not just solely dependent on road transport, but you make use of rail, for example, or maybe even waterways, it helps to spread the risk of a disruption, right? Now, the extent to which the risk is reduced by that also depends on the risk profile of these low carbon transport modes. But as a rough cut, I mean, you could say that if you spread your freight across more modes, you're then going to be decarbonizing your freight transport operation using lower carbon transport modes, but also there can be a risk and resilience benefit from doing that. Another one would be improving the visibility of logistic or freight transport operations, because often the platforms that you put in place to make risk and resilience more visible can also be used for exchanging emissions data, right? It can also help you. I know it's something which the Smart Freight Centre is very active in, obviously through the GLEC program. So if you create new channels for information to flow between businesses, that doesn't just necessarily handle risk data, it can also handle emission data. So I think there's also potential synergy there as well.
Thank you. There is a lot to unpack there, but I think the idea of creating these channels for information flow, for meaningful information flow, is a very powerful one. What about the trade offs between resilience and decarbonization? I know you did mention that some of the factors that you identified, they were synergistic, some were mutually enforcing, and some not so much. So,
Mhm.
are there trade offs between resilience and decarbonization?
Yes, okay. So two potential trade-offs. First of all, is to do with sourcing and modal shift, because it's often argued that if you source more product locally, in other words, if you compress the supply chain, you reduce the amount of risk to which it's exposed. But unfortunately, if you do that and you shorten the average length of haul, you make it harder for low carbon modes to compete for that traffic, because the main low carbon modes of rail and waterways have a comparative advantage in long distance movement. So if you shorten the haul, you make it less likely that they'll be able to capture more market share. That's one. The other one is between carbon intensity and diversity, because as we transition to low carbon energy, away from diesel towards battery powered vehicles, for example, certainly in the early stages, you'll have problems with the range, the battery range, often a lack of charging facilities because those recharging networks are taking time to develop. And so there there is a risk associated with this energy transition, and I think that should be recognized. But I'm hoping this is only temporary, because once we have got batteries that have got a greater range, and once we've got renewable energy systems in place and recharging stations everywhere and all the necessary grid support, that the resilience of an electrified trucking system hopefully ultimately will be as good as that of the current diesel trucking systems as well. But I think in the intervening period, I think there may be a bit of a trade-off between risk and resilience on the one hand and decarbonisation on the other.
And how do we manage that trade off with a long term view? Because I think what you've just said is really important, that we're in this intervening period. We're in this period where we're doing a lot that's never been done before. We're making changes. It's kind of unprecedented and undocumented times while we shift in this new direction. But how do we manage those trade offs? Because they are the reality, they're an uncontrollable, but
Mhm.
we have to not let them get in the way of progress.
Correct. So we wouldn't want companies to be too hesitant about shifting to a battery powered vehicle and delaying the emission reductions you get from switching to a battery powered vehicle, for example. So you're right, there is a balance there. But companies are naturally cautious. which partly explains why the application of that fifth lever, the one to reduce the carbon intensity of logistics, is taking quite a bit of time to operate. I mean, the hope is that we can accelerate the technology to improve battery performance, that we can also invest more heavily on charging networks. And it's not just the charging points, it's also the upstream grid connections, which are having to be improved and their capacity increased. And that is so we're in a balancing game at the moment. And I think the public sector has a big role to play here. Governments can help to alter that trade off between decarbonisation, resilience, certainly as far as the energy transition is concerned in freight transport.
And I think maybe that's a key role that governments and policy, it's a key role for them to play in this transition is managing that trade-off. So we've spoken about the trade-offs in terms of where and decarbonization may kind of run into each other while we make this transition. But what about strategies that address both of them effectively, or examples of where they work hand in hand? Could you maybe share some of
Mhm.
those?
Well, yes. I mean, again, an example I would use here of that would be just in time delivery, because I portrayed that as a synergistic relationship. Because it's often argued that to improve the utilization of freight vehicles, we'll have to relax some of the just in time conditions to give companies more time to load the vehicles better. And also, there's a feeling that if you relax just in time, you'd make it easier to get freight onto rail and inland waterways because those are fundamentally slower transport modes. But if you relax the just in time principle and built a bit more inventory into your supply chains, there would be resilience benefits from that as well, right? So superficially, it seems that there is a synergy between the decarbonization benefits of relaxing just in time and also the related risk and resilience benefits. But it's not quite as simple as that. For one thing, there's research been done to look at the wider impact of just in time on manufacturing systems, on supply chains. So while relaxing just in time might allow us to cut emissions from the freight transport operation, it could easily result in us increasing energy consumption and emissions from manufacturing. So we've got to be careful there. For this is a boundary issue. Where do we draw the boundary around this trade-off between emission reduction and resilience? And if we just confine our attention to logistics, we may make the wrong decisions because we really got to look at this holistically and look at the impact on other parts of the supply chain, particularly the manufacturing operations.
I think that's such an important point that you've just hit on, that we need to look at this holistically and from a more kind of maybe 10,000-foot view, to use the common term, or a more zoomed out perspective. And, we need to look at this holistically, which also means that we're going to need to bring different voices to the table and consider different contributors, different parties, different stakeholders. You've recently written about the potential of supply chain collaboration to drive decarbonization. And it's interesting because we've recently released another podcast episode also focusing on collaboration. So it's clearly a very important theme. But from your perspective, how can collaboration, whether vertical or horizontal, between shippers, carriers, policymakers, technology providers, etc., how can that collaboration help to accelerate broader climate logistics goals?
So you're right. There's a paper just about to come out any day now, really, and I call it "Supply Chain Collaboration: Is it a decarbonization game changer?" Right? And I come to the conclusion, yes, it is. And again, I keep referring back to the five decarbonization levers. The feeling is that the lever that will benefit most from greater supply chain collaboration is asset utilization. That if companies were to share their vehicles and to some extent their warehousing, there would be carbon and efficiency benefits. And it's not just carbon benefits, there would be cost savings as well. So a lot of these things yield economic as well as environmental benefits. Modal shift can also benefit because it makes it easier if companies collaborate to bundle the freight into viably sized train loads, to make it easier to get that transition from road to rail. And then on the fifth lever, which we mentioned earlier, the carbon intensity one, you know, if companies work together to pool their procurement of renewable fuels, that is going to act as a catalyst. That is going to accelerate the transition from fossil to renewable energy as well. And I mean, this being done presumably in what we call book and claim frameworks. And I know that the Smart Freight Centre is very much involved in efforts to establish those book and claim operations. But again, for that to work will require quite a high degree of company collaboration. And, so these are just three ways. And then, of course, underpinning a lot of this is greater data sharing, how companies are more open about their operations, which will make it easier then to identify ways in which there are operational and carbon reducing benefits, if you like, from collaboration.
Yeah, and when it comes to data sharing, I know that the iLeap project from the Smart Freight Center is very focused on creating this safe and transparent ways for companies to share their data. So collaboration is key. Interesting that you spoke about companies sharing vehicles, sharing load sharing, etc. In our podcast on collaboration, we spoke about two competitive fisheries who came together to decide to actually share a ship to
Wow.
move goods around. And, on a surface level, it would be unheard of for these organizations to collaborate, but actually the benefits are exactly as you say. So there's so many benefits that are
Mhm.
environmental, but also economic. And that's just a win in all senses
Yes.
of it.
Yes.
And this is a nice high note. So just before we end, I'm going to put you on the spot here. And for the last question of the last episode of this three-part series, if you could give one piece of advice to logistics leaders who want to prepare for both decarbonization and broader climate challenges, and who have a loaded up full plate of to dos and objectives and targets and complexity to navigate, coming straight to you from Professor Alan McKinnon himself, what is the one piece of advice that you would have for these leaders?
I'm going to step out of my comfort zone here and get a bit political because normally I just keep in research terms and I'm fairly neutral. But one thing that is greatly concerning me these days is what I see as industry pushback against climate change. The subject is being politicized. Politicians are arguing that climate change is a hoax in the case of Donald Trump, or that net zero is unachievable, or it's going to greatly increase the cost of living. And a lot of this is emanating from the US, clearly. And I've heard recently a survey has been done asking companies about how much importance they're attaching to decarbonization in their list of priorities. And these are logistics related businesses. And it seems that the decarbonization is dropping down their list of priorities. And I find that deeply worrying. So, my advice to companies is don't be deceived by all of this. We have to maintain our commitment to decarbonizing logistics. In the US, for example, there's a ideological rejection of a lot of climate science. If you look at the recent climate science, it is deeply worrying. And if you look at the trends and you look at the increase in extreme weather, we should be intensifying our efforts to decarbonize at the moment rather than relaxing or even abandoning some of the net zero commitments in this area. So this is becoming a bit of a rant, really, isn't it? But I think it's really very important to say this because companies may say, well, there's a political era now for 4 or 5 years when it would just make sense for us to relax our efforts. We don't have time. We're approaching climate tipping points and we have to do everything we can do in the short to medium term now to deal with this problem.
Yeah, now is not the time to slow down. Don't be discouraged. Stay the course and amplify the action.
Which is a wonderful summary of what I've just taken. Yeah, 300 words to state.
So, yeah, I think if we can leave companies at that, and I think it's an important message from you because there is a lot of conflicting, confusing, and frustrating information coming at people. So, don't be discouraged. Stay the course, amplify the action. And with that, Alan, thank you so much. This brings us to the end of episode 3 of 3 on climate logistics, resilience, adaptation, and everything in between. Thank you so much, Alan.
Thank you for being a very effective interrogator. I've enjoyed this and I hope that the audience finds it of interest. Thank you very much, Andy.